It was a close-up that pretended to be ordinary. A 19-year-old soldier doubled on the running board of a supply truck, breath frosting the air, a beard of ice already forming on his scarf. For 3 days, he had not eaten a hot meal. The camera of imagination holds that face for a long beat, and then the narration drops a triple promise like a stone into dark water. In 60 seconds, something small will shift. In 4 hours, a command will be given that someone will remember. In 50 years, the measurement of a life will hinge on a single, cold question. This is not one of those stories that find a neat place in manuals or uniform histories. It does not live in the glossy stills of films, and you will search Patton's diary of 873 pages in vain for these lines. That absence is itself part of the mystery. The wind was a hard thing that day, the sort that translates orders into pain. A convoy had stalled on a country lane, hemmed by dark trees and low stone walls. Snow lay thick on the ground, and the trucks sat like black beetles in a white field. A man in a polished leather jacket climbed down from a staff car and walked along the column with the purposeful swagger of a man used to being obeyed. General Patton moved like a metronome through confusion. He passed faces, maps, the small emergency fires men had made to thaw their hands, and then he stopped. "When was the last time you had anything hot?" he asked. The question landed more like a verdict than an inquiry. It was as if the general's boots carried the weight of all the plans that had been made months earlier, and his voice now measured the distance between paper and world. The soldier looked up. The camera of the mind lingers on that lift of the chin, his answer a puncture to the practiced certainty of war. 3 days, sir. That exchange is the hinge. In context, it is absurdly small, a detail of rationing and embarrassment, but the narrative will insist that small things make big histories. The triple promise. In 60 seconds, Patton will make a decision. In 4 hours, that decision will ripple into a command. In 50 years, the meaning of an ordinary cold question will be argued about by people who never stood in the snow. The story being told here refuses the comforting arc of famous plaques and medals. It is a secret history, not because it is conspiratorial, but because it slips through the filters historians prefer, through logistics forms, through a stack of office reports 3 piles high, and disappears into the human ledger. To understand why a question about soup could count for so much, you need a short picture of what the 26th Division was in those weeks. A unit that had been raised fast, pressed forward faster, and fed on speeches and hope rather than training. They had been thrown toward the front like a hastily bound raft into a storm. Supplies had been planned in neat columns on maps. Cooks and trucks were blessed with paperwork. But a winter offensive in the Ardennes had surprised the planners, and the kitchens had, quite literally, failed to keep pace with the spearhead. Roads that existed on paper were impassable in the frost. Convoys were rerouted, delayed, lost, and the men on the line started counting the hours since warmth. What the narrative insists upon is that Patton stopped not out of pure compassion, but because the scene he saw contradicted the plan. He recognized a rupture. The truck that the 19-year-old hung to was not random. It belonged to a supply echelon tasked with an urgent mission, a forward push toward Bastogne. The higher map had decided where food would go. The lower world, the world in which boots scuffed and engines coughed, had decided where it would not. There is background to the story that contemporary ears may have heard as anecdote or bravado. The Hill of Bastogne, McAuliffe's famous defiance, the one-word reply that turned into legend. That moment would be painted in wartime dispatches, pinned into classrooms, narrated on broadcasts. The interaction on the frozen lane was of another type. Small, private, dangerous only to reputations on paperwork. Yet it contained the same grain of truth about leadership. The difference between reports shaped for headquarters and reality shaped for men who would wake up frozen. Patton found himself wedged between the tactical map and the human cost. He could have driven on, engines warmed, posture maintained, and let the backlog of reports and delivery tables stand as their own truth. But he stopped because he saw the frayed seam between plan and person. He read not only the young soldier's tired face, but the implied paper trail. Somewhere back at headquarters, there was a stack of forms, an officer's name typed on a report, and a line that read, in bureaucratic cadence, "Delayed due to blocked route." That report sat third from the bottom in a pile. No one had thought much about the number 3. It is worth pausing here for a brief technical note. Convoys, in those weeks, did not move on intuition. They were the product of a chain of orders and confirmations, of liaison officers and men who ran between snowy hedgerows with messages. Kitchens loaded tins into crates, drivers relied on maps penciled with expected times, battalion supply officers signed receipts and kept lists. When an official route was shelled or iced over, the circuit required an alternative road, an approval, a stamp that could not be produced in the outsize hurry of surprise. The armies that win tend to be the ones that have thought of contingencies. But sometimes contingency is replaced by improvisation, and improvisation costs time. The general's question to the soldier threw that cost into relief. When was the last time you had anything hot? It was not merely an inquiry into appetite, it was a test of the chain's integrity. The soldier's answer revealed that the chain had a missing link. The camera that records such things holds the absurdity. A man, cold and thin, clutching a dented can, while above him the staff car's radio still crackled with a plan that assumed full rations. Patton, who had authored many a plan, recognized what was missing, an imagination for the lives under his directives. Not cowardice, the memoirs would later insist, not incompetence, rather a failure of paperwork to meet flesh. He walked on. The staff car's engine glowed, the driver shifted into low gear, and they rolled forward toward battalion headquarters. There would be formalities, barking of orders, the smell of burning oil and tobacco smoke. Inside the stone farmhouse that served as a temporary command post sat a lieutenant with a stack of reports. The particular sheet that mattered, the one that mentioned the blocked road, the required reroute, the request to alter the supply timetable, lay third from the bottom in a pile. It had been filed, dated, and then left to drift toward obscurity. No one yet suspected that a man with frost on his beard and a general in a leather jacket had entered the narrative and would bend that paper's destiny. That third from bottom sheet, a small rectangle of typed words, was about to ignite attention not because of the text itself, but because of what it represented, a failure to translate plan into warmth. The general would read it, and not only see the clerical delay, but feel the human paragraph that blinked in its margins. The life of a boy from Worcester, leaning on the running board, would be remade by a chain reaction that began with a single cold question. The wider world, the one with its postcards and doctrine books, would later remember only the loud moments, a defiant cablet, the movements of divisions, a photograph of steel and snow. The small scene on the lane would slip into the layers beneath history. Yet the author insists it matters because it reveals something essential about how institutions fail and how a single presence of mind can shove the bureaucracy into doing what it had promised. The lane with its stalled trucks is a microcosm. It is where plans confront weather, hunger, and the weight of ordinary human patience. So the truck drove on, the convoy resumed its tentative crawl, and Patton's staff car bore him to the farmhouse that had been converted into a temporary battalion command post. Inside, a lieutenant would later take a report from a stack and find the paper third from the bottom. He would thumb it, glance at the cold ink, and prepare to file it. He did not know yet that a voice outside had asked a question that would act as a fuse. The narrative leaves that lieutenant for a moment, a small figure among maps, and returns for the next beat, the one where a knock on the wooden door would change the way that day unfolded. Понял. Пишу вторую часть. 1000 слов на английском. Тот же жанр и стиль. Начинаю сейчас. The farmhouse smelled of cold stone and burning oil, a scent that seemed to sit like dust on the wooden table in the center of the room. Maps lay unfolded. Cigarette ash made tiny moons on the floorboards. Men moved with a quiet urgency, the type bred by long hours of waiting and sudden decisions. The door opened without ceremony, and General Patton walked in as if he had been invited by the walls themselves. He did not offer excuses, only that same economy of movement, a removal of gloves, a glance at the cluster of officers, and then he spoke with the bluntness of a man who believed language should match consequence. "Where is your commanding officer?" he asked. He was led to a small table where the battalion commander sat, papered by forms and chewing a piece of pencil like a habit of thought. Lieutenant Colonel Carver had a face that maps years of narrow decisions, tired eyes, a jawline that had hardened with responsibility. Beside him, Lieutenant Sykes shuffled reports and tried to make the room spin on the axis of schedules rather than people. The exchange that followed was tight and low-voiced, a contained drama of rank and blame. Patton's question cut to the pulse. He wanted names, times, and measures, but he wanted something else too, an unvarnished admission if the paper trail had failed. The battalion commander recited the sequence: a blocked road, an initial delay, an alternate route proposed by a sergeant miles down the line, a request left to trickle up the chain for approval. The lieutenant produced a stack of documents and, with shoulders that tried to look steady, showed the general the sheet third from the bottom. It bore the terse notation that one of the supply columns had been forced to divert. The stamped time showed the request for rerouting had been written almost 48 hours earlier and had not been acknowledged. Silence in that room was not empty. It was the sound of responsibility weighing on paper. The general's face shifted, a rapid choreography between irritation and calculation. He wanted an explanation, and he wanted one that would satisfy both the momentum of the campaign and the simple human fact that men were cold and hungry. He looked to Lieutenant Sykes, and the officer flinched as if memory had been called to account. Patton did not summon speeches. He requested the presence of Sergeant Briggs, the battalion's cook sergeant, and when Briggs entered, he did so with a brisk efficiency that suggested he had anticipated this summons. The sergeant was a man whose hands remembered kettles and canned rations better than pen strokes. He spoke plainly, his voice the tone of someone who had been waiting for the moment to explain something obvious that others had overlooked. "Our kitchens loaded what we were given," Briggs said. "The problem started when the route was blocked. We could have rerouted, sir, but that requires signatures from brigade and division supply. Mess detail does not decide roads." He explained, with the kind of clarity that becomes persuasive when men have practiced the task, how the supply chain is a series of gates. A road closed. A sergeant on the lane sent a runner. The runner arrived, and the requisite officer marked the chart. But intermediate steps were slowed by a backlog of radio communications, maps misread under frost, and the simple human fact that everyone assumed someone else was acting. Briggs's words sketched a chain with each link plausible and inadequate. Nothing dramatic, merely a methodical accumulation of delays. Patton listened, and then gave voice to a distinction he often made between failure by fear and failure by imagination. His voice rose not in anger, but in the cadence of someone revealing a philosophy. "There are two kinds of failing," he said. "One is cowardice, a refusal to engage. The other, equally disastrous, is a failure of imagination. It is the habit of turning men into entries and answers into boxes. When you can read a report and not see the hands that bend to it, you have lost the map. He then issued 2 orders that landed like stones. First, open an alternative route immediately. Second, Lieutenant Sykes was to be sent for 14 days to the front, to live with the men, to taste the cold of a sleeping bag, to learn how a report reads when it is not a sheet of paper, but a life. The quiet in the room shifted into action. Men moved with the sudden choreography of assigned purpose. Radios crackled, runners were dispatched, and outside the farmhouse the low engines of trucks began to stir as the logistics machine tried to align itself to a human scale. The narrative now expands its lens and follows 3 simultaneous threads. Bastogne, where an isolated garrison counted its options. The Third Army's headquarters, where lines on a map had to be reconciled with men on a lane. And the road itself, where drivers worked to clear ice and reroute under the pressure of time. The storytelling stitches these locations like stitches on a surgical cloth, each pull tightening the same wound. At Bastogne, messages came and were replied to in a staccato of necessity. Knights of supply argued with infantry about priority. At the Third Army Command, officers bent over plotting boards, adjusting arrows, and noting times on a greasy pad. On the road, men strapped chains to wheels and pried at frozen locks. The convoy that had sat like beetles on the snow began to push again, engines coughing, men shifting to the rhythm of hope that a warm meal might come. The movement toward remedy was not instantaneous. Plans had inertia, paperwork had gravity. Yet the machine, once nudged by Patton's imperative, began to change its axis. Runners sped to arrange brigaded permissions. Approvals were scribbled, scrawled, then stamped. A sense of immediacy infected the chain. In military life, this is not always victory. Sometimes it is simply the salvation of a small decency, a pot of stew steaming in a dented tin that a man can cup in his cold hands and call warmth. Time moved with a merciless clarity. In the late afternoon, the convoy's lead trucks turned onto an improvised route. Drivers knew how to navigate by checkpoints and the sun's low angle. Men walked ahead to beat paths through snow and to test for ice. When the trucks arrived, it was at 16:30 when the first of the warm tins were handed out. The number is prosaic, but the moment was not. Hands that had been numb found heat. The 19-year-old from the running board took a dented can of stew and cradled it like a letter. Soup became message. Meat became proof that someone, somewhere, had altered the map. The scene of eating is not merely sustenance. It is the emotional ledger of the episode. Men who had been reduced all day to ration packs and brittle jokes now held something that smelled of home and normalcy. The camera of memory lingers on the soldier as he peels back the lid and breathes in steam, a gesture that reads as relief and as an answer to the earlier question. The general watched from the edge of the crowd, not for applause, but like a man who had wanted to close the distance between plan and person. This is also the point where the narrative insists on subtlety. The victory is small and bureaucratic, but it is visceral. It is not textbook strategy. It is administrative compassion married to an insistence that the machinery must serve men, not the other way around. Lieutenant Sykes, rawer now from his orders, would later set out to learn what it is to be on the losing end of a form. Sergeant Briggs returned to his kettles with a glow that belongs to those who have been allowed to do their job properly. The climax resolves in a modest tableau: trucks emptying, men thawing, knives scraping cans, and an officer stamping a form that had been third from the bottom. The paper that had been almost lost found its moment. A small procedural victory had become an ordinary miracle. Food in hands warmed bodies and, briefly, repaired the rupture between orders and flesh. The scene is tidy in its closure, but the narrative is careful not to mistake tidy for complete. It closes with a sense of suspended consequence. The immediate crisis, hunger in the lane, was solved, but the lesson about imagination and paperwork had been made explicit and now would have to be learned by those who write reports. The story's center had been a question, and the answer had been a chain reaction of decisions that moved through ranks and roadways. It would be enough for now. For what followed, the wider ripples and the long echoes in lives and history, the tale reserves the last note, waiting for the voice that measures decades.